Welcome back to the Zero Pressure podcast series, a relaxed conversation with those on the cutting edge of science and technology. Hosted by me, Helen Sharman, and presented by Imperial College London and Saab. The Zero Pressure podcast series is looking at how science and technology positively can contribute to solving the complex, interrelated global challenges of today and tomorrow. In this episode, we're talking about how science and technology can help us to manage the polar regions as melting ice due to climate change opens up shipping lanes, makes resource extraction increasingly viable, and throws up environmental and geopolitical issues that affect the whole planet.
Sometimes when we talk about geopolitics or we talk about climate change, we forget that technology is absolutely integral to a lot of what we do in the here and now and what we might do in the future.
I'm very pleased to be joined on Zero Pressure by our guest, Professor Klaus Dodds, Executive Dean for the School of Life Sciences and the Environment at Royal Holloway, University of London. Klaus has extensive experience of working with governments, commercial stakeholders and multinational organisations, including the NATO Strategic Foresight Analysis, which assesses trends and their implications to the security environment. Klaus's research interests lie in geopolitics and security, media and popular culture, ice studies, and international governance of the Antarctic and the Arctic. Klaus, welcome to Zero Pressure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much and delighted to be with you.
I know you started your academic career as, let's say, a planar geographer, didn't you? What sparked your interest in ice and the polar regions?
I think it's probably a product of my age and background in the sense that my father was a Royal Naval officer who served in Fleet Air Arm. And one of the voyages his aircraft carrier carried out in the late 1950s involved Argentina and the South Atlantic. And I think it was really from those quite early days, I was captivated as a child by his stories of life on the high seas. And then also, I think, just simply growing up, certainly I did, with plenty of stories about Scott, Shackleton, James Cook and other British explorers. And I think finally another thing that really sort of helped to cement my interest, certainly in the far south, was just simply witnessing the Falklands-Malvinas War in 1982 and beginning to understand that actually even the remotest places in the world could excite the passions, so to say.
And the geopolitics, I mean, does that stem from these polar regions, or is that a bit like asking what comes first, a chicken or an egg?
I think I was also one of those children who just spent many, many years of his childhood poring over maps and charts. And I was also obsessed with postage stamps. So I think the sort of the turn to geopolitics, of course, I didn't know the term existed, when I was a great deal younger, but it felt sort of quite natural to me. I was sort of captivated by politics and obsessed by geography. So this portmanteau term seemed to sum me up rather nicely.
Now, before we get on to international matters, I'd like to set the scene and start with the polar regions themselves. We know that when ice melts, partly as a consequence of global warming, that there's less of a white surface then to reflect energy back into space from the sun. So there becomes a feedback loop of increasing surface temperature and more ice melt and so on. How significant an issue is this for the polar regions?
So what's being described is effectively called the albedo effect. And simply put, the polar regions and the other ice-covered regions of the world, notably, of course, high-altitude environments like mountains, are incredibly important because what these regions do, in effect, is they help to cool the Earth. They reflect the Earth's solar energy back into the atmosphere. Now, if ice diminishes, as it is doing at an alarming rate, then in essence, land and ocean warms. And that then triggers a whole series of consequences for people who call the Arctic and the Antarctic home. But also for all of us, it starts to interfere, for example, with weather systems and, of course, longer term, our climate. So it's incredibly important. Ice is integral to the future of the Earth.
So it's not really just a local issue for the poles, it's a global issue, even just the ice melting.
Yes, in geographical terms, we would describe it as multiscalar. So what that means is that when you have a problem like ice loss, one of the things that you can do, particularly if you have a geographical perspective, is start to trace out the ramifications of ice loss, not only for local communities, but then you can begin to think about nationally why that might matter. Then you can think about why it might matter regionally, say to a community of Arctic states. And now what we're seeing increasingly is the polar regions are being globalized, so that it's becoming evident that more and more people, whether it's through countries, civil society, international organizations, are beginning to understand that the polar regions matter to all of us. So it's no longer the case that, for example, it should be a sort of matter of laughter to say that Saudi Arabia is interested in the polar regions. Saudi Arabia should be interested in the polar regions.
We've also got permafrost melting, haven't we? And of course, that, apart from making the ground boggy, and there's infrastructure on the ground, homes and other infrastructure, oil and gas I'm thinking in the North Siberian, in Alaska, presumably. There's been a recent case where I think was it a gas or an oil storage, a tank collapsed? Is that right? Was that in Siberia or an Alaskan one?
Yes, no, that's right. So there was an environmental disaster that affected the Russian Far East, and permafrost thaw was blamed for causing a rupture in that oil storage infrastructure. More generally, however, vast areas of Russia, Canada, Alaska are effectively home to permafrost. Another way of thinking of permafrost is just simply permanently frozen ground. And when that ground thaws, it becomes mushy. And so, as you rightly note, infrastructure becomes vulnerable because the foundations on which it's based are no longer stable. But perhaps even more disturbingly, what I think scientists are alerting us to is that actually with permafrost thaw comes methane release. So all that methane that was previously permanently trapped or frozen underneath the surface is now being released. And that's not only a problem underground, so to say, but we also have vast areas of subsea permafrost. So you've got methane being released into ocean as well as directly into air. And that, by the way, is something that I think has still not been properly accounted for in climate change modelling. So it's a massive issue. And if you're wondering how permafrost thaw becomes geopolitical, then one of the reasons it becomes geopolitical is that the largest area of permafrost to be found anywhere in the world is in Russia. And when we have poor relationships with Russia, as we do at the moment, it means it's really difficult actually to coordinate information sharing about this crucial aspect of environmental change.
Take me back just a little bit in terms of the methane coming from the permafrost. So as I understand it, it's we have so much methane because all the organic matter that's been laid down over millennia decomposes really slowly in these very cold climates. And it's been trapped because of the ground's been frozen, unfreeze it, and now we've got this huge amount of, let's say, carbon in the soil just ready for release. Is that an oversimplification?
It's exactly as you say. So you've got these very slow accumulations of organic matter, slow in terms of the amount of time they've taken to build up. It has been trapped by simply frozen earth. And as that thawing action has begun to take hold of that previously permanently frozen ground, so then opportunities have emerged for methane to escape. So it is really a very, very disturbing problem. And the other thing, just to sort of throw into our sort of conversation, is that all of this is being made worse by the outbreak of very large wildfires, particularly in the spring and summer season. And what that means is, and this really is the sort of the double whammy effect, you've got subsurface warming, which is then being compounded by the burning of that very organic matter and, of course, other things such as forestry. So in general, the ground is being warmed by climate change and fire. And in combination, it means a warming Arctic is just increasingly discombobulating. And that has then all kinds of feedback loops precisely because of this extraordinary change.
Some of these fires go on for a long time, don't they?
Yes, we actually have a term which is zombie fires, and the reason for that is that you might think, for example, in winter the fires would be snuffed out, but actually, just like those terrible moorland fires you sometimes get during English summers, these zombie fires don't necessarily die out because it's cold and dark, but they continue to sort of burn very slowly, and then what happens is that when the weather warms up again, they then reignite and then take a hold again of that already ravaged landscape. So they never stop, hence the term zombie.
What technologies are being used and developed to make the Arctic Ocean more safe and secure, connected, possibly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting issue, because I think sometimes when we talk about geopolitics or we talk about climate change, we forget that technology is absolutely integral to a lot of what we do in the here and now and what we might do in the future. So to give you an example, in the Arctic, it's still an incredibly challenging environment to work. Our maps are not complete. The internet can be patchy and unreliable. Weather can be disruptive of communications. And of course, for many months of the year, the Arctic is still a very dark and cold place. But what we've seen in the last 2 decades, of course, is that many things that are commonplace further south are starting to make their presence felt in the high north. So, for example, GPS is being improved in the high north. The internet and social media are now becoming more commonplace in Arctic communities. Drones are being used by shipping operators to help them gain real-time intelligence about sea ice conditions or weather conditions. And in general, ship design, ship training is also being improved or revolutionized so that ships can operate more safely in ice-filled waters. So there's no assumption being made at this stage that ice is just somehow disappearing and no longer a hazard. But what is happening is that design and technology are playing a crucial role in helping, I think, improve the operating environment, not only for northern communities, but also for commercial and military operators as well.
We famously don't have much satellite connection over the poles. That, I understand, is improving. Will that help people who are living there and commercialism, or is that mostly for the military use?
So satellite coverage is improving, and more countries are investing time and energy in improving satellite-based communications as well as satellite coverage. It's worth saying that since 1979, satellite coverage has been absolutely essential in helping us map and evaluate sea ice coverage and or extent in the Arctic Ocean. So when you see climate change stories talking about sea ice diminishing or sea ice in retreat, you might see in those articles or TV programs or short videos references being made to the late 1970s. And that's really the start of the satellite era. So with most things, there's always a double-edged quality to it. So on the one hand, yes, satellites have been absolutely integral to improving civilian-based science, and that's helped to inform our decision-making and our understanding of climate change. But of course, there's another element to all of this. There's no accident that countries like China have been investing in polar satellites. And that's in large part because China wants to be considered to be a polar power. So one of the ways you do that is you improve your satellite capability, your mapping capability, and you're able to tell the rest of the world that you're a serious operator in these places precisely because you have a good understanding of what's going on.
Now, a lot of this mapping stems from satellites in geostationary orbit. And you mentioned GPS. They tend to be very high up satellites as well, which tend not to be as useful in telecommunications because you get that lag time, don't you? We call it that latency between us saying something and then the signal bombing up to the satellite and then coming all the way back down again. Is there a way to get around that? Will people always just have to use satellites for communication? Can we do something that will improve that latency? Maybe use, I suppose, a larger number of lower down satellites, or just something else, another type of technology that we might be able to put to use?
Yes, I mean, I think there's been an interest in a number of things that sort of speak to this issue of latency. I mean, the one is, as you rightly say, is there's a growing interest in sort of lower altitude satellite networks. And I guess sort of Elon Musk's Starlink has been one that often sort of grabs sort of global media attention. But I think that's something that's also being discussed for the Arctic, precisely because we do have this sort of patchiness problem when it comes to satellite-based GPS. Another probably worth stressing is a real interest in developing underwater submarine communication cables. So there are plans afoot, for example, to traverse the Arctic Ocean and to try and improve communications networks through cabling. And at least one of them, of course, came to attention recently, connecting Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago, which is about 600 miles south of the North Pole, to mainland Norway, because a story broke that had been sabotaged, and there was speculation that Russia might be responsible for that sabotage. So again, I think what's worth stressing here is that on the one hand, it would seem to make perfect sense that we would invest in technologies that improve communications, diminish latency, help to connect safely various activities that we know will come and go through the Arctic. But on the other hand, it also represents a security challenge. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is Arctic and non-Arctic states really seeking to marshal their forces, marshal their presence in order to make sure that their interests are maintained and respected.
I'm just trying to imagine the technology required to lay underwater cables or cables under the North Pole, essentially across the Arctic Ocean, when you're going under huge thicknesses of ice. Presumably these are all going to be autonomous vehicles that lay these cables, and they probably are when they go across the Atlantic anyway. But that's quite a feat, isn't it, of precision in engineering?
Yes, I mean, these are extraordinary interventions. And, you're absolutely right. Things like underwater drone technology has been really important in both the Arctic and Antarctic. I mean, indeed, we saw it recently with the discovery of Shackleton's ship in the Southern Ocean. Underwater drone technology is a game changer. It's a game changer when it comes to infrastructural projects, but it also is contributing, I think, to a growing awareness that as the Arctic Ocean becomes a busier maritime environment, those technologies are also going to contribute to, surveillance and what is called domain awareness. So Arctic states like Russia and Canada and the United States and Norway are wanting, of course, to benefit from this growing accessibility and interest, but they're also wary. They're wary of what other countries, might be China, it might be India, are seeking to extract from the Arctic. And some of that might just be simply information and knowledge. And that's why science can often find itself in quite a tricky situation where it ends up being perhaps more politicized than scientists would certainly wish.
We'll come back to Klaus shortly, after this piece from Sean Trevethan, who's the maritime lead in defence investments at NATO headquarters. Sean and I were talking in a panel discussion initiated by Imperial College London's Institute for Security, Science and Technology in the UK's Royal Geographical Society at the 2022 Great Exhibition Road Festival. Here's a quick extract from that discussion, where Sean shares details of the technology of underwater autonomous vehicles in the Arctic.
Under the ice and underwater is a very hostile environment, and actually communications are incredibly difficult. So when we want to send an autonomous, so unmanned underwater vehicle under the ice for any extended period, it actually has no connection to the outside world. It doesn't have a GCS feed. It doesn't have a command link kind of beyond a mile under the sea, and pretty much literally on its own. And we have to basically RV with those types of vehicles.
RV?
Rendezvous, sorry. It's ex-military, so I'm just... with those vehicles at a certain point in time, and we want them to go and collect a vast amount of big data. So we want, a large processor on board that can actually collect that data with various sensor suites. But with no GPS, you think, well, how on earth is it going to navigate? Effectively, most AUVs have this thing called INS, which is an inertial navigation system. So it basically feels how it moves, okay? And then for those mathematicians in the audience, it'll integrate twice, broadly speaking, for that motion, and it'll be able to predict the point in which it should be at. Now, the sensors, we're looking at putting quantum sensors to monitor the motion of these vehicles.
So quantum sensors being sensors that just really look at, instead of measuring things on a broad scale like that, but a lot of light, they might measure a particular photon coming from that light. Yeah,
so quantum is just a lot greater sensitivity when it comes to quantum sensing. So instead of having like your ruler at school where you can go down to millimeters, you can go much, much, much further down, much higher accuracy of sensing the motion. Therefore, you have a much higher accuracy in terms of where your AUV is going to pop up, which means you can put them on longer missions for longer periods of time with higher confidence that they're going to pop up within a set area that you determined. And that's even based on variations in undersea currents, etc. So quantum is going to be a bit of a game changer for us. And to make it really, really simple, it's probably an order of magnitude more accurate to have quantum sensing helping with those types of inertial navigation systems than the traditional methods. And the traditional methods are still pretty good. And with that, you're going to collect more data. So we're going to rely on machine learning applications really to kind of process that data and kick out the products we want. So we get the products at what we call the speed of relevance, because there's no point in sending it away in the military for 3 months for analysis when we're operating in real time. So we need to know what's going on in that sense.
Thank you to Sean Trevethan. Let's go back to Klaus Dodds and explore the geopolitical landscape of the polar regions and beyond. Has the Ukraine crisis, do you think, harmed a lot of these sort of collaborative opportunities? Possibly that those, I'm thinking that the scientists who would have worked together in the Arctic with the Russians.
I think one of these sort of areas of collateral damage that unquestionably has occurred as a consequence of the worsening relationship with Russia has been the diminishment of opportunity, particularly for early career scientists, to work with their Russian counterparts. So, for now, it seems inconceivable that young British scientists would be working alongside young Russian scientists. Formally speaking, the Arctic Council, the intergovernmental forum that helps to shape the sort of political and scientific business of the Arctic region, has been put on pause. The 7 Arctic states have said that they can't work with Russia at the moment. Finland and Sweden are joining NATO. So, geopolitically, the Arctic is really entering, I think, quite a tense period. But there's also been another element to all of this. What the Ukrainian invasion has done has pushed, of course, Russia closer towards China, towards India, and potentially other Asian states. So if Russia is no longer looking westwards, it is unquestionably looking eastwards. And it's just worth remembering that China, for example, is a major permafrost science provider. And there are lots of areas where I think China and Russia, not just strategically and economically, which we're familiar with in terms of hydrocarbon projects, but also scientifically, where I would confidently predict we're going to see more collaboration. We're going to see more Arctic science diplomacy involving other Asian states such as India. And I think what we're in danger of seeing is a Arctic being separated out between North American and European Arctic states working closely with one another, including partners like the UK and Germany, and in essence, a Russian-Asian Arctic, where those parties work in close collaboration with one another. And I think the danger is what happens is that the Arctic becomes disaggregated. It becomes split into two as a consequence of geopolitics. But if you had a scientist on this program, they would absolutely reinforce this simple message that we have to study the Arctic as a complex, integrated region, which is in itself entangled with wider Earth. So the idea that you separate these things out makes literally no sense at all.
Is there any technology that's being developed specifically for geopolitical security purposes?
Yes. I mean, I think whenever the Arctic has featured in terms of geopolitics, technology has never been far behind. I mean, let me give you an example that was really quite outlandish at the time, but sort of perfectly illustrates how a cold environment can attract science as well as military strategic interest. So in the 1950s and 1960s, the interior of Greenland was becoming increasingly a hotspot for ice coring, and multinational groups of scientists were traveling to Greenland, extracting ice, and all that important work that was subsequently being done on climate reconstruction owed at least in part to ice cores being taken from Greenland and, of course, Antarctica. At the same time, the US military, under what was called Project Iceworm, were speculating that they could store nuclear missiles under the ice, hide them from prying Soviet eyes, and then secretly dispatch them as and when necessary if they thought they were being attacked. And if you go fast forward 40 years, what you find over and over again is technology that scientists will put to work, such as drones, for example, now increasingly crucial in science, are also being used for military applications. So Russia, for example, has a number of drone squadrons that it uses as part of its patrolling of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. Underwater drones are being used to monitor movement in Arctic marine environments. You know, both Russia, the United States, and the UK continue to do under ice submarine operations. One day China might have under ice submarine operational capabilities. And all these sorts of technologies, whether GPS, whether drones, satellite communication, always have this sort of dual usage. And that's been a really persistent trend in Arctic environments.
Then coming back more to the sort of environmental geography aspect of what we're talking about, all of this sort of urgency in terms of the geopolitical nature of the polar situation, but also because of the climate crisis. Do you think that this gives us a little bit more need to emphasize, let's say, the investment in new, say, carbon capture technologies or some other technology that can actively slow down global warming?
Well, I think in general, I tend to be skeptical about some of the more adventurous projects that have been suggested for the polar regions. So, for example, you will encounter stories that say, one way to deal with Arctic sea ice decline is simply to manufacture artificial sea ice. And that way we might be able to arrest the warming trend of the Arctic Ocean. Or, for example, just as happens in alpine countries where you have the blanketing of glaciers, I've also heard suggestion that we need, large scale extensive blanketing in order to try and prevent glacial environments from being further struck by ice retreat. I think my argument in general is that we have the Paris Agreement. We know what we need to do. The science actually is overwhelming in terms of why we need to take climate change seriously. We now need to act, and that action has to be through the political and the economic. And that's something I'm afraid that sits very awkwardly for many of these Arctic states, because fundamentally they're resource economies. Norway, Canada, Russia, Alaska owe their very existence in large part to resource extraction. Now, what you also see, particularly in the Nordic Arctic, is something else which is interesting, is the Arctic cold being used to do different things. So, for example, Facebook famously has some of its servers based in northern Scandinavia because it's cheaper to keep them cooler in a cold environment. The Svalbard Seed Vault, where we preserve some of the world's plant species, is made possible precisely because it's in a cold environment. So you've got throughout the Arctic lots of interesting examples where cold environments have acted as a stimulus to technological and scientific innovation. And we're starting to see more investment, for example, in renewable energy projects in many smaller communities in the Arctic, precisely because they're trying to move away from expensive diesel technology.
Tell me a bit more about this renewable energy idea using the Arctic, I guess, in particular. I mean, there must be an awful lot of wind up there, surely. So even without creating new technology, can we not utilize some of the wind as a renewable?
Wind energy would appear to be the most promising in the Arctic, as opposed to, say, solar energy, for fairly obvious reasons. But of course, as the Norwegians have discovered as well, there's also hydro energy. And as Iceland has long demonstrated, geothermal energy can be relevant in other places as well. So I think where there's been a sort of a sustained investment and effort, renewable energy does have a future in the Arctic region.
Now for some quick questions. What do you see as the most exciting project being undertaken in the polar regions at the moment?
I think one of the most exciting projects is really a sort of continuation of earlier work. And that's really the sort of the holy grail. How far can one go back in time through an extracted ice core? So I have to confess, I'm utterly preoccupied with the idea of ice core research.
Is there anywhere else in the world where the local effects of climate change are having such a large effect on geopolitics?
I think one area to look at is something like sea level rise. So, for example, where places are simply being inundated, and then that has ramifications geopolitically if land simply disappears.
And finally, did you foresee the current polar issues as being dominant when you started out in geopolitics?
Simply put, no, I didn't think they were going to become as exciting as they have become. And I think, to be perfectly honest, they're only going to grow in excitement.
Look, Klaus, thank you so much for a fascinating, if not rather alarming, insight into the polar regions and international geopolitics.
Thank you very much for having me.
Klaus talked about how climate change is multi-scalar, that it's local, regional and international all at the same time. And although GPS and internet need improvements in reliability, satellite and drone technology, in particular underwater drones, are contributing to surveillance and domain awareness. Thank you for being with us on this podcast discussion. Join us again next month when we'll be discussing how to prepare for complex crises that threaten national infrastructure and our daily life. Please do share the podcast, tell a friend, and of course, tune in. In the meantime, I leave you with this thought by Kofi Annan. Some have suggested that ideally there must be some international body that would treat areas like the Arctic as a global commerce, a bit like the way we treat the sea. It doesn't belong to any particular country, but to all of us. But I'm not sure some of the powerful are ready for that sort of solution.